Julia here from Juris Education. I'm really happy you could all join us today for our LSAT Masterclass, and we're going to be touching on logical reasoning today. So we've got a couple of things that we'll be going over today, but just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. As we go through the agenda, we'll have a designated Q&A section. So if you do have any questions for our panelist, Mika, we'd ask that you type them in the chat box, and then if we have time, we'll get to them throughout the meeting, but if not, we have a designated Q&A section. So like I said, we'll have that Q&A section. I also want to flag that this webinar is going to be recorded. So if you'd like to go back and review, or if you missed something, we will be sending this webinar out to all attendees 24 hours afterwards, so you can stay tuned for that. Just to go over a little bit about Juris Education, if you haven't heard of us before, I will go ahead and say our little spiel. So we're a globally recognized law school admissions consulting firm, and what we do is we offer comprehensive support from test preparation to law school admission and even bar exam tutoring for when you're almost done your law school journey. We have a 94% acceptance rate with our students, and they get into the top law schools in the US. Last cycle alone, our T14 acceptance rate was 34%, which is almost 6 times higher than the national average, which is around 5.7%. Our philosophy is that we believe in starting the law school application process as early as possible, which is why we offer pre-law advising and profile development. This focuses on building each student's professional cover letter and resume to highlight their most meaningful experiences. We also help candidates boost their academic transcripts in GPA and stellar internships, and to help create a timeline for their LSAT prep. Our one goal is to get applicants into their dream law program. We also offer private LSAT tutoring, which assesses each candidate's strengths and weaknesses and helps us create a custom study plan structured for the days, weeks, and months ahead. We tailor our approach to each student's unique needs and schedule, providing the right assignments and lessons as they become familiar with the content, strategies, and format. On average, we see about a 12-point increase for 45+ hours of tutoring, and we offer a 165+ LSAT score guarantee with our 60-hour program. Once we've helped shape an outstanding candidate, we support creating the perfect application. This guides the creation of a well-balanced list of target, safety, and reach schools. We also help build strong resumes and obtain letters of recommendation for the right recommenders. Our admission counselors, who are also essay writing experts like Mika, who's joining us for this call, will brainstorm, outline, and edit until your supplemental essays and personal statement are perfect. Our goal is really to build the perfect candidate and application. We use every tool in our skill set to really ensure that the products that we create with our students stand out from the rest. So with that said, we're excited to assist you with the process and look forward to our consultation. Just a reminder that for everybody that's joined, you might want to stay tuned because we have a little discount for everybody that's here if you want to go ahead and go through with our program, but stay tuned for that because that'll be coming up shortly. Just to go over what we'll be covering for our webinar today, like I said, we're going to be breaking down logical reasoning. So you're really going to find out how to approach the logical reasoning sectioning. And then, of course, Mika's going to share her best tried and true study tips from she's a top-scoring tutor, as we know. For those of you that have, been on or joined us for a webinar before, you know that Mika's the best. So really great opportunity to learn from the master here. And like I said, we'll go ahead and have that live Q&A session. So if you do have your questions, type them in the chat box and we will get to them. That said, I'll go ahead and let Mika introduce herself for those who haven't met her yet.
Hey everyone, I am Mika McDonald. I am an LSAT tutor and admissions consultant here at Juris. I took the LSAT twice in 2011. I scored a 172 the first time and then a 179 the second time. After that, I went to the University of Chicago Law School. I clerked for a bankruptcy judge in Delaware when I graduated, and then I worked as a corporate restructuring litigator in Delaware and New York for about 5 years. I left the practice of law in 2020 and have been teaching full-time since then. Really excited for today's session because we actually are going to get to jump into some questions at the end. So we'll learn a lot about how the logical reasoning section works, what you should be focused on when studying, and then we'll actually jump into some real stuff. So yeah, I'm excited for that. Can we switch next slide? Awesome. So let's just start with the fact that there are 3 scored sections on the LSAT. 2 of those 3 scored sections are logical reasoning sections. They'll typically have 25 questions each. That's the standard size. So logical reasoning is about 2/3 of your overall LSAT score. Logical reasoning is not just about the skill of logical reasoning, which is not an individual skill at all. It's also about understanding complex relationships in English, right? It's about being able to distinguish between the words that set up premises and the words that set up conclusions. It's about seeing the relationship between an argument and then a rebuttal to that argument and how the evidence is changing or if new evidence is coming in, right? There is a whole spectrum of skills involved in this test. And it's not just the logic, it's reading skills, it's language skills, it's retention skills. There is no such thing as like brute force memorization on the LSAT, right? You can memorize the names of all of the common flaws that show up in the flaw section of the LSAT, but knowing the names isn't necessarily going to help you or make you able to identify those flaws under timed conditions, right? So while the LSAT involves some memorization, and again, I would say some, less than 10% of the LSAT is memorization, the vast, vast majority is what I would call analytical skills, right? And so, and that analytical skills implies that the way you're thinking about things will matter, right? You have to both search for the reasons why something is the right answer, but also for the reasons why every other answer choice is wrong, right? This is not an easy test where it's easy to distinguish between good and bad answers all of the time. So this is a long way of saying that the LR section is complex and it involves a lot of skills and it involves a lot of time and work to master all of those. But ultimately, this is a skill-based test, right? So I just want to emphasize that this is learnable and doable, right? Next slide. Question types. We only have 3 written down here. I meant to have more. I think in the last time we did this, the slide had more. So what are 3 of the most common question types? Number 1 is flaw, by far the most common, right? A flaw question is exactly what it sounds like. You are identifying what is already wrong about this argument. Some sort of gap in its logic, some sort of analysis that doesn't make sense, some sort of misapplication of conditional logic rules. But ultimately, there are 2 parts here. Identify the flaw and then describe it in the form of the correct answer choice, right? And both of those aspects can be quite difficult, right? The identification can be difficult, but so can the answer choices, right? Finding your analysis and matching it to an answer is not nearly as easy as it is on any other exam. Necessary assumptions. We have that written as assumption questions. There's a second type called sufficient assumptions that are a little bit different. But necessary assumptions are the second most common question type on the exam. And it basically asks you to look at an argument and then say, what other thing has to be true for this argument to function? Right? What is the necessary assumption that the author has not yet said? Right? This is a tough question type for most people because it sort of involves thinking in negatives, right? Like what is missing that should be here rather than attacking what's there or strengthening what's there, right? We're thinking about something that doesn't exist yet. So it's a very complex question type. I usually teach there's about 8 different types of necessary assumptions. Like core ones to understand because they recur on the exam over and over and over again. And we said that on the slide in the last page, but it is also worth emphasizing again that a lot of this test is patterns, right? Certain types of arguments that have certain types of structures and certain ways of attacking and defending, they recur over and over and over again. So part of what makes you get a high score in the logical reasoning section is being able to understand those patterns and identify them when they're happening in a question. Technically, weekend questions are the third most common question type, but it's a little bit like cheating. So I went with the fourth, which is only slightly behind it, inference questions, right? In these questions, we're not given an argument. That's not what we're doing here. Now we're given data. We're given a few sentences of information, and we are trying to identify the most defensible conclusion you could draw from it, right? So inference questions kind of feel like the opposite of a lot of the other big question types, where we're looking at an existing argument rather than making our own conclusion. So those are three of the biggest question types. That's fine. But ultimately, there's somewhere between 20 and 25, depending on like which test prep curriculum you're looking at, right? So those are the three biggest, but there are a lot more. So how does the LSAT trick us? The biggest one is these small wording details, right? If we're dealing with what's called quantifier logic, a quantifier question, one tiny word, like mistaking some versus a most, instantly makes an answer totally incorrect. There's also little things like that in regular sort of non-conditional logic, where I call it a level of detail. The author maybe goes 1 degree too specific, right? We're looking at something in the prompt that's about heart disease, but then the answer choice says good health. And those aren't exactly the same thing, right? Heart disease is part of good health, but it's not all of good health. So these little switches in wording, maybe talking a little bit out of scope, a little under scope, they really drive what we call like the best bad answer, right? That trap answer that people fall for. It's all about the wording. The other thing the LSAT does is it tries to make incorrect choices look good. One way they do that, which is hilarious when you point it out to people, but it's very true, is the wrong answer will use a lot of the same language from the prompt, and the correct answer will use different terms that mean the same thing. They're just not the exact language used in the prompt, right? It's a sneaky trick, but it happens constantly, and people do fall for it, right? There are lots of these little traps they lay throughout the test. Another one that's really well known is just incredibly abstract answers. What was it? There's a methods of reasoning question where the correct answer is using the impossibility of an outcome to infer its non-existence. Right? Like, that's really abstract language, right? A lot of answer types, especially flaw questions, rely on this super technical abstract language in answers to raise the difficulty level. So wherever we look, the LSAT is deliberately creating difficulty. That's a good way to think about it. All right, you can go next one. So with all of that said, how do you master the logical reasoning section? Well, number one starts with the basics, right? I often see students trying to rush towards strengthen, weaken, flaw questions because those are some of the most common. But the first thing you need to do is be able to understand arguments. What are the pieces of an argument? How do I identify and distinguish between a premise, an intermediate conclusion, and a final conclusion? Right? Because even if those aren't the things that are directly tested in a strength and weaken flaw question, those are skills you absolutely have to have if you are going to consistently get those question types correct. Right? So focus first on understanding the types of arguments, understanding how arguments can be broken down, understanding their components. Right? Once And I would call that, when I'm teaching, I have a core grouping of main conclusion questions, role of statement questions, and method of reasoning questions. That's what I call my core group. It's what I start with every student. Actually, I do paradox questions first because they're fun and they get people engaged and excited about the test. Paradox questions are the best. And then I do the core grouping. Once you have mastered those fundamental skills, right, you should be able to do what I would call, it says predict, but I call it anticipation, right? You want to always think about what the right answer should be before you look at answer choices. Jumping straight to answer choices without taking those 5, 10, 20 seconds to pause and think, that's how you get tempted by wrong, well-written wrong answers, right? You rush in and you get destroyed as a result. Instead, I mentioned certain types of arguments that recur. So one type of argument is what I would call just recommendations, right? The author says, hey, we have this goal. Here's this fact. Therefore, I think you should do this thing, right? And when you're attacking or defending that type of argument, the two big things you're usually thinking about are feasibility and effectiveness, right? Can I argue that this plan isn't actually possible or doable, at least within the constraints that they had in the prompt? Or could I argue that maybe this would backfire, or maybe it would just be ineffective, right? So when you see recommendations, you anticipate an answer that fits into one of those two ideas, right? And then I go into the answer choices looking for something that fits that sort of framework. And 9 times out of 10, that's going to get me to the right answer. And then the other 10%, that's where the advanced skills kick in. But once you learn the patterns of these arguments and what they're usually strong and weak at, you will be able to answer these questions much more quickly and much more effectively. And finally, in terms of learning, I hate that I have to say this because I feel like I shouldn't, but I'm going to say it. Doing questions without reviewing them is pointless. Literally pointless. It does not matter. You could do all 10,000 plus questions in a row, but if you don't review what you're doing wrong, you're not going to get much better, right? What matters most in studying is not the time you spend doing questions, it's the time you spend reviewing them, right? It's using that time effectively. It's doing questions and immediately reviewing them and not waiting till the next day when you've already forgotten what you were thinking at the time, right? It's all of these little things of just make sure your study time is actually being used fruitfully. I think that's a key to success in life, but definitely a key to success in the LSAT. Do not just churn through questions without doing deep review. Okay, so precision reading. I mentioned this idea of like a slight shift in the scope of what's being said, right? So the author switches from a broader topic to a more narrow topic very, very quickly and without notice. And in fact, something like 20% of necessary assumption questions are literally just what I described. The author shifted from a narrow level of detail in their premise to a broader level of detail in their conclusion. And our necessary assumption says that's okay, right? These two things, despite not sounding equivalent, are in fact equivalent to one another, right? So some of this test, a good portion of this test is really subtle stuff. Another one that people miss, but is wildly important, is the strength of a conclusion, right? Let's think about the difference between saying something will happen, saying that something will probably happen, and saying that something might happen, right? Those are very different conclusions, right? If I can prove one exception, the will falls, right? One exception makes that argument wrong. If you say probably, now I have to show that you're more often than not wrong, at least a 50% chance of being wrong. And so you'll see this in both reading comp and in LR, where there'll be tiny little shifts in how they're describing the intensity of the conclusion. But if you misdescribe the intensity of the conclusion, you're wrong, period, and stop. I'll again say pattern recognition. I just gave you guys examples. So I'll give one more. Another one I just call inductive reasoning. Very standard. We're going to see an example of it later. But inductive reasoning is when the author goes and looks at the world and says, hey, that thing's interesting. Here's how it happened, right? It's very Sherlock Holmesian type reasoning, right? You look at something and then you explain how it happened to come to be that way. So it might be a doctor saying, hey, there's a correlation between these two medical issues. I think the first issue causes the second issue, right? That's a form of inductive reasoning. It might also be like, hey, my partner just walked in the door and she's wet. I think it's raining outside, right? That's inductive reasoning. So anytime you look at the world and try to explain how it came that way, you're in inductive reasoning. So if we are strengthening, weakening, necessary assumption, or flaw with inductive reasoning, we're usually thinking about alternative causes, right? The author looked at some data and made a big jump to a conclusion, and I'm saying, hey, this other thing also fits the data, right? And so the author's wrong because either of these conclusions could be valid based on the data we currently have. Things like reverse causation. You say A causes B. I say, why can't B be causing A? Or maybe a third factor is causing both things, right? When we're dealing with these inductive reasoning questions, what we're really dealing with is causation, right? So we think of the traditional ways to attack causation, and that's what we're looking for in the answers. Okay, roll for it. Check in. I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, I just want to use this as an opportunity. I know I mentioned this briefly in the beginning of our webinar, but if you missed it, just for signing up for this webinar, we are offering a 10% off discount for your entire program. That's 10 off web. You can scan the QR code there to go ahead and get started. So if you're interested in working with a counselor like Mika and really getting all of her insights and knowledge, feel free to go ahead and scan the QR code and start your journey today. Like I said, we'll be sending this webinar out to all attendees, so you can go ahead and if you don't take a picture of it now or don't write down the code now, we'll send the webinar out so you can go ahead and do that at your leisure. Okay, back over to you, Mika.
Okay. So, strengthening your foundations here. I mentioned earlier that the test is poorly written. And not poorly written in the sense that they don't know what they're doing, poorly written in the sense that they're deliberately using poor English to make things feel more complicated than they are. So one of the things that all of us do when presented with this type of English is mental retranslation. We take this bad English and our brain sorts it out, right? Typically by trying to rephrase it into better phrased English that's more comprehensible. So one of the first exercises I have students do, and if you ever heard of the book Loophole, it's a logical reasoning training book. It's one of the first exercises in there as well, is rephrasing arguments. Take the thing that you're doing unconsciously and practice it consciously so that you'll be better at it unconsciously. I think everything is like that, right? If you learn how to play basketball, play chess, at first things are not, you have to like really think and learn. And then you're Michael Jordan, you're just pumping 999 out of 1,000 free throws over and over again without even thinking about it, right? So same idea. Understanding what the author is doing is a core part of both sections. This and reading comp. Typically, the question stem gives you a good idea, right? The author's making an argument and we need to strengthen it. The author's making an argument, we're trying to weaken it. But when we think about what is the author trying to prove, we want to ask, what is the specific phrasing of this conclusion, right? So for example, if I say, I think that water is not effective at removing stains, and someone says, but it's great for drinking, that has nothing to do with the argument I'm making, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about whether it has good value overall. We're talking about one specific purpose of it, one specific usage. This is constantly happening in the LSAT. And again, it's that sort of trap, right? They want you to think the argument is bigger than it is. And then they can bring in considerations that shouldn't matter. And those considerations make for great, tempting wrong answers, right? So really, really think about what the conclusion says. Nothing more, nothing less. Strategic practice. So I am firmly of the opinion that there is no reason to do timed practice early on. None whatsoever. Hopefully you're studying months in advance of your exam, right? And your goal when you first start out should be to build skills. Understand the test, build basic skills. Trying to build basic skills under timed pressure, you can kind of hear how nonsensical that sounds, right? So I'll just go ahead and say that it's pretty nonsensical to try and build your core skills under time pressure. So start with untimed and then gradually transition to timed work, right? I often tell people to sort of do a step down process, right? Let's say you're doing untimed and it would take you 45 minutes to do a section. Okay, next time give yourself 43 and then 41 and then 39, 37 and back to 35, right? Gradual step down. Good analytics, right? Tracking question types that are throwing you, argument types, anything like being able to see what you are strongest at and weakest at is valuable. Some curriculums really love analytics. Some curriculums hate analytics. I think they're useful. And I think that tracking your progress also feels good. For example, a lot of test prep services have what are called sort of milestones, right? Where it's like, hey, you can answer this many 3 stars correct in a row. You've achieved level 3 milestone. And I know it sounds maybe a little silly, but it is a really useful way to track progress. And to just get that sort of sense of what you're doing well and what question types are maybe throwing you for a loop more. But either way, regardless of whether you self-study, you work with a tutor, you use a test prep, you should be thinking constantly about what you're doing well and what's giving you problems, right? It's hard to improve if you don't identify what you need to improve at. All right, next slide. So, how to break down LR questions, right? Identify the argument structure. You would be surprised how many arguments in the logical reasoning section rest on one factual premise and nothing else. That's something that people don't pay enough attention to, right? If I read a paragraph-long argument, but then realize, hey, the first 2 sentences are just like background info, the third sentence is the only evidence for the conclusion. That makes it easier to figure out how to attack the conclusion, right? Because there is a material difference between arguments based on one piece of evidence, which means if you break the value of that evidence, you break the whole argument, versus arguments that are based on 2 or 3 pieces of evidence. And therefore, breaking one piece of evidence does not break the overall argument, or at least not necessarily. So breaking down what the stimulus is giving you is really important, right? What are the premises? What is background? What is the conclusion? Is the author making a silent assumption in order to reach this conclusion? So once you've broken this down, you kind of identify the argument type that you're dealing with, and you're kind of looking at I don't know, just getting answers correct. I told you before, anticipations matter. It is not required that you anticipate the specific wording of each answer choice. I don't want students to set that as a goal. Better for you to anticipate what sort of answer would work here, right? So I look at a stimulus and I say, this one's about causation. I think there's a possible third cause idea here. I'm not exactly sure what it's going to be, but I do feel like third cause would work here. And then I go and look for that, right? So even if I don't have the specific wording, I still understand the concept that I'm looking for. So finally, process elimination. I am a believer that if you have the time available, you should do strict process of elimination, period, and stop. The only time you shouldn't do process elimination is because you need the speed. And hopefully you will have improved enough that you don't need to do that. But again, wrong answers are tempting, right? It is not good to say, B looks good, I'm going to mark it and move on. Because in relation to E, the correct answer, maybe B doesn't look so good, right? And every answer, not all answers are good trap answers. Some are just there. But good trap answers need a little thought, right? You have to think about why they are traps. So point being, the goal ultimately is that you can move fast but slow, right? Fast enough to get done in 35 minutes, but slow enough to think about answer choices and eliminate all of them. Well, 4 out of 5 of them. Right, excellent. So, accuracy over speed, we kind of just talked about this, right? Focus on building your skill set, understanding the section, understanding the question types and what they're looking for, and then build speed. Period and stop. That is how you're going to do best on this exam. This exam is ego challenging, right? You will not be able to roll up and score high. Just sort of period and stop. Naturals at the LSAT aren't a thing because the LSAT isn't a test of natural abilities, right? It's a test of learned skill, critical thinking skills primarily. So just remember when you see those red X's everywhere that everyone is going through that. You're not doing bad. You're not doing worse than other students. Getting a lot of questions wrong is part of the process of getting good at this. So don't take it personally. It's really easy to, even if you're not trying to take it personally, it wears on us. But again, sometimes we have to lose a lot to win, right? I played chess competitively growing up. And so the LSAT and other intellectual challenges like that, I felt like always came easier to me because I was just not bothered by losing, right? Every time I got a test back, it didn't bother me that I missed that many because, that's chess. You just play the next game. So embrace that sort of mindset, right? Every practice section and every practice test is just another game. And you may lose this one, but you'll win the next one. And then finally, right, repetition. Like there's 10,000 plus LSAT questions. I tell people that I probably spent about 150 hours studying before my first exam and about the same amount of time before my second. I took PTs 63 and 64. So those were the 63rd and 64th tests ever given of the LSAT. I probably had done the first 40 by the time I took my first exam, right? I had done all of the questions associated with like the first 40 tests. So to do this so quickly and effortlessly that you get a 180 requires you to do a lot, right? Just repetition, right? You can see these patterns so quickly and so easily. I mean, me as a tutor, right? I do this constantly, and I can say that I am better at the LSAT now than when I started tutoring, because I constantly see these questions and break them down, and that makes me better and better over time. And if you want that like 170 plus score, you want to go to Harvard, you should expect to do thousands of questions before you take the exam. Any other expectation would be unreasonable. Yeah. All right, keep rolling. All right, steps to boosting speed. Simplifying arguments. One of the things that you develop through, oh, sorry, I have a cat attacking me right now. One of the things you develop through repetition is the ability to see what matters and what is being used for distraction purposes, right? So you want to get to the skill level at which you can break this conclusion down. You can see which facts are helping build it, and therefore which stuff doesn't really matter, right? And you can see the pattern it's making. But again, that comes with a lot of practice, a lot of learning, and a lot of repetition. Skip and return is something I strongly advocate. No one is looking over your shoulder and making sure you're doing questions 1 through 25 in that order. And that's because there's no requirement that you do questions 1 through 25 in that order. There just isn't. So then the question is, what's the best strategy? And the best strategy is, if you've been on a question for more than 3 minutes and you haven't made progress in the last 30 seconds, move on. If it's a parallel reasoning question, move on. Parallel reasoning questions are diabolically time consuming. They're both super text heavy, and the answer choices are super text heavy. So no matter what, it's going to be a time suck. So I tell people, just do them at the end, right? Why let them ruin your flow early on? Kick them to the end. And then I tell students, feel free to do that with question types you hate, right? If you hate must be true questions and they are your biggest weakness, why would you force yourself to do a must be true question when you could just do the next question over? Right? Save the stuff that you want at the end for the end. Nothing's stopping you. And then comparing answer choices. I gotta say, one of the most frustrating things for me is to watch a student read an answer choice, look at the stimulus, read the other answer choice, look at the stimulus, read the other answer choice, look at it, like just back and forth and back and forth. And it's like, what are they doing differently? What is the difference between these two answers? And if whatever that difference is clearly matters because one of them is wrong. So ask yourself what the difference is, right? Don't just keep going, the passage looks like it would support this. The passage looks like it would support this. It can't be both. So what's different about them? When we talk about those little wording issues early on, this is also one of the easiest ways to spot them, right? Stop looking at the passage and compare the two answer choices, and you'll go, oh, this piece of wording here takes this out of scope. Okay, I see why B is wrong and D is correct, right? So directly comparing answers is an advanced tactic that pays off a lot. All right, keep rolling. Yeah. So this is going to be a 3-hour sit-down test. You get a 10-minute break in between the second and third section. Just for clarification, I said there are 3 scored sections on the LSAT at the beginning. This is accurate. There's a 4th section you'll have to take on test day. It's an experimental section, which just means that they're testing out questions to use in future exams, right? So that section does not count for the test, but it is part of the exam. So this is 3 hours. I don't know if y'all know much about what law school first-year exams are like, but those are 3-hour sit-down essay-based exams. So this level of stamina is not just necessary here, but for your future law school career. So how do we build endurance? We take it. We take practice tests. We get used to sitting for 3 hours. There's really no way around that, you know. I guess you could play like competitive chess games. Those are like usually 4 hours, well, 2 to 4 hours in length. But that's about the only thing I can think of that's comparable. So regularly take practice tests. At first, untimed. Again, I'm going to hit that idea that you should always be working untimed at the beginning. And as you get closer and closer to test day, switch to time. Doing full sections itself is important. If you're just studying one question type and doing one of those questions over and over and over again, right? You're not having to switch between tasks. You're doing the exact same mental task over and over again. That makes it easier. On test day, like I said, there's 20-ish or so types of questions on the logical reasoning section, right? You are constantly switching between this solving mode and that solving mode and this one and that one, this one and that one. That creates fatigue in and of itself. And you won't be able to be trained. You can't train for that fatigue other than by experiencing it. So regular practice sections and practice tests are the way to build that fatigue. When you are actually taking the exam, I have some simple tips, and I'm just going to sound like, you know, your mom or your spouse, but, you know, eat a good breakfast, maybe like exercise regularly. That always helps. You know, be mindful, take, you know, stop to breathe if you start to panic. Stretch your legs under your desk so that blood doesn't pool in your legs and cause fatigue. Have like a slightly sugary snack, like a granola bar or something during the 10-minute break to get that little boost for the last 2 sections. All of that sort of stuff. But this is ego challenging and exhausting, right? Which in turn very clearly can lead to emotional turbulence. The students that do worse on test day are the ones who get tilted, right? And who don't do something to recover from the tilt. So being mindful, right? Having a way to pause and breathe and reset. I did that on both of my exams. There were moments where I was like, I think I'm starting to move too fast. I'm like rushing. I'm you know, not in my flow anymore. And so I stopped and I breathed and I felt better, and then I got back to it. But you don't want to be the person who's been PTing in the 160s and then scoring the 140s because you lost your composure, right? So getting prepared for what you're going to experience on exam day is very important. Okay, keep moving. I think we hit some of these, but I'll just start with, you're not going to learn anything the day before the exam. Stop trying to learn new stuff. Take the day off, right? Make sure your batteries that are 100% or as close as they can be on exam day. And that means taking the day before off. Get good sleep, exercise, meals, etc. Pacing, right? If you feel like you are rushing, then you are losing. I'm going to be a dick like that right now. But if you feel like you're rushing, then you are doing something wrong, right? We want to be deliberately paced. We want to be moving at a good, comfortable, but quick speed. We never want to be rushed. Being rushed leads to errors upon error upon error, right? And trust your prep. I often see students, they'll have a favorite answer, and then there's a second answer that they can't really get rid of, and then they'll choose the second answer. And I was like, but that wasn't your favorite answer, was it? Like, you liked the other one more. And they're like, yeah. And so I was like, well, why did you choose the one you liked less? And they always kind of look at me like, because they didn't think about it like that. And the answer is they don't trust their instincts. Some people trust their intuition and some people don't, or at least don't notice that they aren't. When in doubt, trust your intuition. Period and stop. If you are stuck between 2 answers, choose the one you liked most when you first read them. Second guessing yourself especially after you've studied and worked hard and trained for this, right? That's only going to lead to worse outcomes, right? Trust your prep. Trust your intuition. You probably will end up working for months and months and months to achieve this. Trust yourself. All right, next slide. All right, practice questions. So we've got our first one here. It's a strengthen question. So our author is going to make an argument, reach a conclusion, and our goal is to strengthen the argument. We might bring in new evidence. We might indicate that certain evidence is more powerful or less powerful. We could rule out alternative answers, like alternative explanations. Basically say, hey, this other explanation can't be the case. Any of those things works. So let's take a look at this one. I chose this one. Researchers have studied the cost effectiveness of growing halophytes, salt-tolerant plant species, for animal forage. Halophytes require more water than conventional crops, but can be irrigated with seawater. And pumping seawater into farms near sea level is much cheaper than pumping fresh water from deep wells. Thus, that's our conclusion indicator word, strong conclusion indicator word. Seawater agriculture near sea level should be more cost effective in desert regions, although its yields are smaller than traditional freshwater agriculture. Okay, so what I heard was a pros and cons list. Did anyone else notice that? Halophytes have the negative of requiring more water, but they have the positive of being irrigated with seawater, and pumping seawater is a lot cheaper for these farms near sea level. Cool. Okay. So if I am trying to strengthen the conclusion that this would be cost effective, I could add more evidence indicating that, right? I could say there's another reason this is cheaper, right? Indicated. Or I could say that the reasons we've given for it being cheaper are really big ones, right? Or I could rule out a potential downside, right? Something like, I noticed that they called this in desert regions, right? So maybe something along the lines of the volume of water that can be transported is sufficient to irrigate the desert region. Something like that. But ultimately, I am looking for something that strengthens the idea that seawater agriculture with halophytes would be cost effective. So let's take a look. Give it we're running short on time. I'll walk through them. So A given volume of halophytes is significantly different in nutritional value for animal forage from the same volume of conventional forage crops. Is that what we care about here? Right? One of the things I'll point out is, what does significantly different mean? Does it mean more or less? We don't know, is the point. So even if A were relevant, the fact that they just said significantly different doesn't tell us in what way, right? Do halophytes have more nutritional value or less? So A is out, right? A is not specific enough to have any meaning. B, some halophytes not only tolerate seawater, but require salt. Why do we care? The whole point was we're going to irrigate them with salt water. Telling us that some of them have to have salt, well, we're already going to give them salt. Who cares? So B adds nothing new. C, large research expenditures are needed to develop the strains of halophytes best suited for agricultural purposes. Super relevant, right? But definitely a weaken, right? This would be a downside, and we're not trying to add downsides here. This would be a great answer for a weaken. D, costs other than the cost of irrigation are different for halophytes grown by means of seawater irrigation than for conventional crops. I'm going to refer you back to A. Different. Different how? Different more? Different less? I don't know. D doesn't say, and therefore D can't be the right answer. But we've got E. Pumping water for irrigation is proportionally one of the largest costs in growing, harvesting, and distributing any forage crop for animals. So E took a fact that was already in our favor, right? It's cheap to pump the water here. And it said also, just in case you didn't know, pumping water is a really huge part of the cost. So we elevated the value of the existing evidence, right? We made the existing evidence more important. And there we go. Classic strength in question. All right, let's keep moving. All right, necessary assumption. So you see this argument stem? The argument requires assuming which one of the following, right? So what this is saying is that this is a fatally flawed argument if the answer isn't true, right? So if this assumption we're adding is false, the argument falls apart. So when we enter a question like this, what we're really trying to do is say, okay, where would this fall apart? What is missing here? Because clearly something is missing. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to add the necessary assumption. So let's take a look. A large survey of scientists found that almost all accept Wang's law and almost all know the results of the Brown-Eisler experiment. But those results, together with Wang's law, contradict the Minsk hypothesis. Therefore, most of the scientists surveyed reject the Minsk hypothesis. So, this is inductive reasoning, right? It's the authors looking at these surveys and these results and then making a conclusion based on it. But it's about people, right? It's not about the world. It's about people. People can be inconsistent, right? People don't have to be the same thing all the time. People's beliefs don't have to be the same or not even conflict with each other. People also have a distinction. People can think, people can believe, people can know. Those are different things, right? So, when I look at this argument, I see the scientists accept Wang's law. They know the results of the Brown-Eisler experiment. Do they know that those results together contradict the Minsk hypothesis? Does the argument say they know that? No, right? So we go from a statement that the scientists accept something and then the scientists know something, and then just a statement that those two things combined contradict something else. But these people might not know that, right? This is a sub-issue called knowledge, belief, and intent, right? Anytime the test starts talking about what people think or do or know, we need to start thinking about knowledge, belief, and intent issues. So I think the necessary assumption here is that these scientists know that these results contradict the Minsk hypothesis, right? We might also say something like, these scientists also accept Wang's law, right? Because there's not necessarily a connection there either where maybe they know about it or not. So let's take a look. A, the scientists surveyed are generally aware that the results of the Brown-Eisler experiment, together with Wang's law, contradict the Minsk hypothesis. That feels pretty decent, right? These scientists also know this thing. B, the scientists in the survey who know the results of the Brown-Eisler are exactly the same ones. We're in a necessary assumption question, right? When the LSAT says necessary, it means is every detail of this answer choice necessary? So a word like exactly the same do they have to be exactly the same? What if they were 99% the same? Would that be a big deal? And if the answer is no, then B is wrong. So big, strong language is hard to justify in a necessary assumption. So B is out. C, almost all the scientists surveyed are familiar with the way in which the results of the Brown-Eisler experiment were obtained. That doesn't tell us that whether they reject the Minsk hypothesis or not. D, the sample is large enough to be representative of scientists in the field. So this is always an issue that pops up, right? Sample sizes, are they large enough? Are they representative? Here, there's no reason to think that this isn't representative. They said a large survey of scientists. Maybe there could be sample issues, but nothing in the prompt indicates any sort of sample issue. So we can knock D out. There's just no evidence that that's an issue. And E, also I'd point out with D, the conclusion here is that most of the scientists surveyed reject the Minsk hypothesis, not that most scientists reject the Minsk hypothesis. So D is also irrelevant because our conclusion only cares about these people specifically. And then E says Wang's law is in fact shown to be true, whatever. That doesn't prove or disprove what they believe about the Minsk hypothesis. So A, I think, is the obvious necessary assumption here. It bridges that knowledge gap for Wang and Brown-Eisler and carries it over to the Minsk hypothesis. Cool.
Right. Sorry, Mika, it looks like we're running a little bit out of time. Do you mind? I'm not sure if there's another practice question, but do you mind if we just skip straight to the Q&A just to make sure
go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So I'm having the QR code right there to book a free consultation if you're interested. I know we're at time, but I'm hoping we can just spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes on the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, type them below and we will go ahead and get answers for you. I know there's some that were kind of coming up through the chat, and I think there are some that you might have answered already. Cheryl asking how you can increase the speed of reading and comprehension. I know you touched on that already, but maybe while we're waiting for somebody else to ask the question, you can touch on that again.
So the way to think about it is not just the speed and comprehension, it's also retention. Right? How much are you retaining as you move through the questions? And it's also about accessibility. How good are you at looking for information, right? Retrieving it quickly from the passage when you need to go back and get things. So what I can say is comprehension can be improved through the trite but kind of true advice of reading dense academic materials. Comprehension can be improved through those retranslation exercises and looking for other people's explanations of prompts. Retention can be improved through good note-taking or good highlighting. And retrieval, speed of retrieving information can be improved through good note-taking, good highlighting, and good use of the search bar on the test. So I don't think that there's like a reading speed magic bullet out there, but I will say that the skill set is a bit more complex than I think you might be giving it credit for. My big thing is note-taking. I'm a big fan of note-taking, have been my entire, postgraduate career. And I think that's the best method to approach reading comp with, is good, effective, quick, short, dense note-taking. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll take the next 2 questions and then we'll have to call it. Question from Ayana. Do you have any tips for working past getting lost in an unfamiliar subject matter presented in the stimulus?
So I would say that in the logical reasoning section, there is typically very little, if any, need to have exterior knowledge of what's being talked about. if it's feeling out of pocket for you to some degree, what I would say is this about causation? If it's about causation, just focus on where they're drawing the causation connections. Even if you don't understand like the field that they're talking about, the language they're using is drawing relationships, right? Is this a comparison, right? Comparisons have certain argument issues that are associated with them. So I think that's the way to approach it in the LR section. In the RC section, where it's more long form, right? You're reading an entire passage about a topic you don't know. Again, technically speaking, you shouldn't need outside knowledge, but it definitely like helps us feel more at home and comfortable with what's being talked about. So overall, I would say doing a lot of questions helps. And in the LR section, I would say looking for those underlying patterns and structures will help a lot. So that would be my kind of general advice.
Okay, our last question. How common are principal questions?
Like 15% of the test. There's two types of principal questions, at least from my perspective, principal strengthen and principal conform. They're both about like 7.5 to 8% of the test. Principal strengthens are a little more common, I think. Yeah, I like principal questions. I think they are a great entryway into conditional logic. But yeah, they are not the most common question type. I think the two of them put together are about as common as strengthen questions, just like the 5th most common question type.
Amazing. Okay, I think that wraps up all of our questions. I want to apologize for going a little bit over, and thank you so much for everybody that stuck with us. Appreciate you. Like I mentioned, the webinar will be sent out to all attendees 24 hours after I press end. So stay tuned for that. Want to thank you again for joining us, and stay tuned and help to join us at the next webinar for Juris Education, and we'll see you then. Take care. Have a good one.